Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my review of the new Sigma 17-40mm F1.8. This is a DC art lens. This is the spiritual successor to the 18-35mm F1.8 that I reviewed over a decade ago. It became a cult classic that it seemed like everybody was shooting video on for a while, adapting it to various platforms. But this is a lens that really is improved in every way. It's got a bigger zoom ratio, it's got a smaller size, it's got lower weight, it's got more features, it's got way better autofocus, and even improved image quality. The price has not yet been released at this moment, but I suspect will be somewhere under $1,000 US. I'll add a note in the description when the final price has been announced. In today's world, companies are keeping that pretty close to the vest ahead of their release date because things are fluctuating so much. But will this new 17-40mm f1.8 find the success of the 18-35mm? Does it deserve to have that same degree of success? Well, that's what we're going to try to explore today, right after a word from our sponsor, which is Chipfancier.
Today's episode is sponsored by Chipfancier, maker of high-quality memory cards. When Sony first introduced cameras with the cfexpress Type A spec, I was initially disappointed as the cards were just so much more expensive than SD cards. But today, I can get a 512GB Chipfancier card for just $200, and this new generation is ultra fast with read and write speeds up to 1,750 megabits per second. In fact, I found that the card speed exceeded that of any of my reader interfaces. This is perfect for a high-speed burst of my Alpha 1 at 30 frames per second or shooting 8K footage at high bit rates. The Chipfancier Gold Type A cards have an IP68 waterproof rating, use a high-tech 12nm manufacturing process, and come with a lifetime warranty. The cards have even been over-provisioned with double the stated capacity to allow for greater longevity and data reliability. Get high quality and high capacity for a very reasonable price by visiting chipfancier.com. That's chipfancier.com.
So before we jump into the review, a quick disclosure. This lens was loaned to me by Sigma Canada. However, they have not had any kind of input on my findings, nor have they seen this video before you, the public, see it. As always, this is a completely independent review. So let's take a look at that build and design here. This is a great looking lens, by the way. I'm testing it in Sony E-mount, but it will also be available at launch on Fuji X-mount along with L-mount. And then a little bit later on, I think around August is what they're saying, we're going to see it in Canon RF as well, which is a very interesting platform for it. Focal range here is magnified by the crop factor of these various systems. So for Sony, Fuji, and L-mount, it's all 1.5 times crop factor. And so that is an effective focal range of 25.5mm to 60mm in full frame equivalency. Very, very useful in a lot of ways. Things shift a little bit further to the right on Canon with its 1.6 times crop factor. So it's 27.2 to 64mm. This is an APS-C lens. So the lens, as noted, it is smaller. Last year I reviewed the 28 to 45mm f1.8 for full frame. It was a really big lens, considerably longer and bulkier than this lens and almost twice as heavy. And so this lens is definitely benefits from being for the smaller APS-C sensor. And so the lens is 72.9mm in diameter, 2.87 inches. It is 115.9mm or 4.56 inches long. It is, by the way, an internally focusing and internally zooming lens. And so if you're a little put off by it being a little bit larger, remember, this is a constant size. And there are tons of advantages to the internal zoom process. If you're going to use it on a gimbal, you have consistent balance, you have a smoother zooming process in general, and of course it's going to very likely retain a better degree of weather sealing because there's nothing moving externally on it. And so this is it's not a small lens, as you can see, but neither is it huge either. It weighs in at 528 grams, which is about 18.6 ounces. Sigma says this is 30% lighter than what the 18 to 35mm was, and so that's a huge improvement in that regard. This is to my knowledge, it is the first modern Sigma APS-C lens to get the art treatment. Yeah, there was a few primes very, very early on very first lenses that Sony made for, or excuse me, that Sigma made for Sony E-mount. They called them art for some reason. They weren't, but this is the first real APS-C art series lens coming from Sigma in the, what they called for a DN for a while, or mirrorless. And so most of these APS-C lenses have fallen under the contemporary branding, and so they've got relatively few features and, you know, the lower degree of build quality. In this case, however, we're getting all the features, we're getting all of the weather sealing, we're just getting a high-grade professional quality lens here. And so that starts with an aperture ring with all the bells and whistles. By the way, on Canon RF, this is going to be a control ring to match their aesthetic. And so that means it's just going to be clickless, a little bit different than what I'm describing right here, but this will apply to all the other mounts. And so what we have is the ability to either have clicks or declicks. And so you can go clicks with 1/3 stops. And then also there is an iris lock that will allow you to either lock into or out of the aperture ring, whatever your preference is. There is a declick option, and so that you can smoothly rack through all the various options. That does allow you to do aperture racking, and I could not see visible steps. And so they've done a good job of making that, again, a proper simulation of a manual, fully manual aperture ring. So good job on that front, Sigma. I'll also note that the manual focus ring is a great simulation as well. It has a nice weight to it and a really great feel. And so it actually feels like you are manually focusing, even though it's focused by wire, which is the case with all mirrorless lenses that have autofocus. And in this case, we have also got a few other features. We have got a AF/MF switch here on the side, and then we have redundant function button. So that means that whether you're shooting in a horizontal position or in a vertical position, you're still going to have one of those function buttons near to hand. And as always, you assign the value to that function button from within the camera body itself. The build itself here is really, really nice. I think that their new logos and fonts just look, they're elegant. They made good choices there. And this lens has a really great design where it's got some glossier sections that divide up the various rings, and on the back, for aesthetic purposes, even in the middle section here, they've extended the ribs of what look like a ring, and so you have a nice symmetrical division on the back of the lens. Really great looking and great attention to detail. It does include a very nice hood. Sigma's hoods are top notch. It's got the lock, it's got rubberized sections. It's just high end, got some grip sections for mounting and unmounting it. It's just a really, really nicely executed package. And so, I mean, I give them high marks on that. Well done for that. Inside, we've got 11 aperture blades. And as you can see here, as I run through this racking sequence again, the geometry is okay, but it's not flawless. Minimum focus distance is 28 centimeters, and that allows you to get a nicely high, right under 0.21 times magnification. So there's lots of useful applications for that. And of course, the fact that you can get relatively close to your subject is going to be helpful for video work as well. No built-in OS or optical stabilizations. You're going to have to rely on in-camera stabilization if your camera is so equipped. Those of you that have cameras without that, that could be a little bit of a factor for you. Overall, however, though, I think Sigma's done a great job of moving the lens upscale in terms of the feature set here, while also managing to shrink it, while at the same time expanding the zoom range. That's a pretty great accomplishment. And yeah, I'm sure there are going to be plenty of you that complain about how big and heavy it still is. Physics, unfortunately, you can't beat physics. Sigma's done a great job of reducing the size and weight of this package to what I think is a very manageable level for an f1.8 zoom that covers all the way from wide at 17 millimeters all the way up to 40 millimeters. So good job on that. How about autofocus? Sigma really turned a corner right under 2 years ago when they launched their HLA, which is high-speed linear actuator, new focus motor as opposed to the older STM focus motors. This is a great focus system. It is extremely snappy. As you can see here, near instantaneous back and forth, whether indoor or outdoor. It is extremely quiet. Even putting your ear next to it, you're going to hear next to no sound. And there was a major issue back in the day with the 18 to 35 millimeter, at least in my experience on Canon, when it came to autofocus consistency. All of that is long gone at this point, and this lens is very accurate to focus, does good with tracking, it does all the things you would want it to do. No problem when it comes to stills. I was able to nail focus in a wide variety of conditions. And of course, a faster maximum aperture of f1.8 means that those of you that maybe are going to shoot for weddings and dimmer venues, that helps a lot, even compared to an f2.8 zoom lens. Remember that f1.8 is 1 1/3 stops brighter, and so that means you're able to have more than twice as fast a shutter speed because you're letting in over twice as much light, and so that's going to be incredibly useful in those kind of venues, and all of that pays off even for autofocus. Likewise for video AF, video focus pulls looked great. Confident, no visible steps, moving back and forth without pulsing or settling or any of those things. I found that there is actually minimal focus breathing here, and so on Sony, you get no focus breathing compensation from the camera, but frankly, I don't think you really need it much here. Focus breathing is at a nice low level, and so that's great, again, for video work. The one thing that I wish was present that's not is the lens is not parfocal. And those of you, a lot of people are going to be intrigued with this lens for video. If they would have been able to make it a parfocal lens, I think that would have been really appealing. Fortunately, it's not the case, and so you'll see when zooming in and out, there is split seconds when things are not in focus. However, its focus is fast enough that it adjusts pretty quickly, and so it's going to be a minimal issue most of the time. My hand test, as you can see, went fine in terms of transitions from the hand to the eye. And again, fairly cinematic there. I will give one just kind of caveat, and that is if you're doing shots where you're just kind of allowing the camera to naturally pull focus from one subject to another, in the native settings, it's tuned a little aggressive, and so it's a little too abrupt in making those focus changes. So you might want to just detune focus speed a little bit to get a little bit more of a cinematic transition from one subject to another. Overall, however, autofocus is fantastic here. Great job, Sigma. Now, how about the image quality? I'll give you my overview, and then if you want the deep dive, that comes at the end of the video. This is an optical design of 17 elements in 11 groups, including 4 SLD elements and 4 spherical lenses. And so you can see here from the MTF that MTF at 17 millimeters, really, really great in the center through the middle of the frame, and then a fairly steep drop off into the corners. Corners, according to MTF, are not nearly as sharp as what the center and mid frame are. We can see that it's a little bit flatter at 40 millimeters, not as extremely good, but certainly not as extremely bad in the corners either. So just a little bit more of a consistent profile. If I throw up the comparison that Sigma provided to the 18 to 35 millimeter, you'll see that they have actually a fairly similar optical signature. It's just the new lens is just a little bit better everywhere across the frame. Nice thing about this faster maximum aperture of f1.8 in a zoom is that it does give you more of a full frame f2.8 kind of look. And so it's going to give you shallower depth of field, a little bit better subject isolation. It's useful, no doubt about it. Now, those of you that are thinking that maybe you're going to get a full frame coverage out of this lens, you can see here that really it's not, particularly at 17 millimeters, it's not covering the full frame at all. And if you zoom in, it gets better, but there's still mechanical vignette everywhere, even when shooting video, yes, where the corners are cropped out. So, I mean, you might, if you're using like a smaller crop in some kind of situation, like a 1.2 times crop, towards the latter part of the end of the zoom range, you might be able to get away with it. I don't think ever at 17 millimeters are you going to be able to pull it off. You're going to have to be shooting Super 35. That's really what this covers. And so don't buy this lens to use it in other applications. Use it for what it's intended for, and I think you'll be much happier. There are some issues when it comes to longitudinal style chromatic aberration. There's a surprising amount of fringing, particularly after the plane of focus. I found that too when shooting on the SLR that I use for testing for this. You can definitely see fringing on the shiny bits. Lateral chromatic aberrations, no problem. It's nice and clean there. There is another optical bugaboo that shows up when you look at the 17 millimeter N when it comes to distortion. Barrel distortion is quite strong. I needed a plus 22 to correct for it, which is a lot. However, I will kind of give the silver lining, and that is that it's a very kind of linear distortion pattern. And so I was able to correct cleanly, even doing it manually. And of course, correction profiles will clean that up without any kind of problem. Vignette, as we're going to see, is really great all throughout the zoom range. I only saw a plus 38 here on the wide end, which would typically be the worst end when it comes to that. And we'll see that it just continues to drop down even a little bit more as you go throughout the zoom range. And so that is never a problem. Now, about the middle of the zoom range, that distortion pattern switches to a pincushion style of distortion. It's mild in the middle of the zoom range. By the time you get to 40 millimeters, it's a little bit more strong and obvious, and so I needed a minus 11 to correct for the pincushion distortion. I will say again, it's all the distortion that I manually corrected was all nicely linear. I could do it manually without a problem. And as noted, vignette is great throughout the zoom range and lowest by 40 millimeters. Now, when it comes to resolution, I will give one caveat, and that is that I'm testing on Sony, which means 26 megapixels is the maximum resolution available. If you're shooting on Fuji, you can expect, if you're shooting on the Fuji 40 megapixel sensor, I should say, expect all of these results to look a little bit softer there. That's a very, very demanding sensor. And so very often zoom lenses like this, most lenses are going to look a little bit softer there when you're looking at them cross-platform. But this is a strong lens, as we're going to see for the most part. So what I found, even looking at 200% magnification, that in the center of the frame, as the MTF suggests, center and mid frame look excellent. No problems, good contrast, good detail. And then you'll see that the corners definitely look softer, as the MTF suggests. As you stop the lens down, contrast will start to improve, a little bit in the center and the mid frame, but the corners don't really sharpen up until f5.6. They never reach the level of the center of the frame, but they get, I think, acceptably good out in real world shots at 100% magnification. I was happy with images, except for maybe the final 2 to 3% in the extreme corners, which frankly, unless you're critically looking at those like I am for a test, I don't think that most people will notice. So I don't consider that to be a big deal. And of course, if you're shooting video, not going to be a big deal at all because those parts of the frame aren't on that 16:9 crop. And so don't worry about that. There is going to be the typical issues with diffraction after f8, so f11, a little bit softer, f16, a little softer still. All of that's expected. It's part of, the physics of optics, I should say. As I moved on throughout the zoom range, I found that at 24 millimeter and then at 35 millimeter, 2 points that I tested, that the resolution was very similar profile to what I saw at 17 millimeters, just a little bit better in the corners. Not great, but better overall, and they sharpened up a little bit faster in the corners. Obviously, you're also dealing with less distortion, and so that becomes less of an issue in correcting for those corners. 40 millimeters is really kind of following a similar pattern, where the center of the frame looks good, mid frame looks good, corners are softer but not as soft. And so remember, MTF shows it's just not it's not as high a performance in the center or mid frame, not as low performance in the corners. And that's really the way that it bore out in a real world shot. However, I felt like my real world images looked great, good pop, good detail to them. Overall, I found like the images really looked good. I wouldn't say, in my opinion, they're quite as magical as what I found the 28 to 45 millimeter F1.8 from Sigma. I thought that was a really top-notch lens, but again, it's working with a bigger sensor, so maybe a little bit more magic, that's already baked into the cake. Here on APS-C, I didn't find it quite as exotic because it's not as shallow a depth of field. However, I found that images looked really, really good. The one, again, caveat I'll give to that is that up close at 40 millimeters, detail and contrast isn't off the charts. However, if I stop down a bit, here this shot is at f2.8, and it looks pretty fantastic, I would say. Bokeh quality is, in general, it is nice, it looks good. Flare resistance seemed to be fine. Overall, this lens, it delivered really, really well outside of some distortion and then also, of course, some fringing in certain situations. So my conclusion is this. This is a very strong lens with only a few flaws, and I think that none of those flaws are going to be deal breakers for most people. Again, some people may complain over the size and the weight, but I mean, this is reality. All things considered, they've actually done a great job in maintaining what you've got here is extremely, extremely useful. It should be a very compelling lens for those who do wedding, videography as well for that matter. It's a lens that's got a lot going for it. And, obviously depending on the price is going to make it slightly more or slightly less compelling depending on where it actually lands. But I suspect that this lens is going to be a serious disruptor on probably all the platforms that it lands on, because this is doing something that no one else is doing. And Sigma, in their pretty unique style, is really pulling it off really well. This is a elegant looking lens, and it is a pretty elegant performing lens as well. Now, if you want a deeper dive into the performance here, you can either check out my text review, which is linked in the description down below. You can also check out the image gallery that is linked there. And now, if you want a deeper look at the optics, let's dive into that together.
So we'll start by taking a quick look at this zoom range here. And so here you can see the difference between the framing of the same scene at 17 millimeters versus 40 millimeters. Obviously a good amount of versatility there. Sometimes you get these big aperture zooms and the zoom range is really limited. That's really not the case here. You've got enough to make meaningful differences in not only the framing you can do in a scene, but even the kind of images that you can shoot. One of our bigger optical bugaboos here is the barrel distortion at 17 millimeters. However, as you can see here, even with a manual correction, and by the way, Sigma gets great correction profiles, and so I'm kind of showing you worst case scenario. But even if I manually correct it, you can see that it corrects in a very linear fashion. No obvious mustache style distortion pattern there, and so that's great. And you can see that vignette is really, really low. And so I've dialed in a plus 22 to correct for the barrel distortion, and a plus 34 to correct for the vignette, which is really low for a lens like this with such a large maximum aperture. Now, fairly quickly, that distortion inverts to a pincushion style distortion. You can see now instead of bulging out, it's sucking in here in the middle. Again, it remains very, very linear, so very easy to correct. Often pincushion distortion is easier to correct than barrel anyway, but no problems here, nice and linear. Also, good news is that vignette is staying really, really low, and so now it's even lower, even less to correct in the 20s, and so about a stop, which is great once again. Now, by 40 millimeters, the pincushion distortion is a little bit more pronounced, as you can see, but as you can also see, it's still linear and easier to correct. This is now a minus 11 to get this result here, but now we're down to just like a plus 23 to correct for the vignette, which is fantastic. Frankly, I was a little surprised by the amount of fringing I saw even through the viewfinder when I was running this test, and you can see it's a pretty prominent kind of a teal color, and so it definitely shows up, and I did see it, as you can see here on this shot that I also do of a real-world example of the SLR, and on these shiny bits you can definitely see that fringing is present. So just note that if you're shooting at f1.8 with shiny objects, particularly if it's a really shallow depth of field up close like this, you're going to see that, and also you can see a little bit of that fringing around specular highlights, maybe less of a big deal there. Lateral style chromatic aberrations, on the other hand, are basically perfectly neutral, and so no problem with that at all. Now, when it comes to resolution and contrast, we are looking here at 200% level of magnification, 26 megapixels on Sony. You can see that center of the frame looks great. Good detail, good contrast, good delineation of the various textures there. Mid-frame is also looking really solid. The MTF suggests that we're going to see consistent results through the mid-frame, and then it starts to drop, which is what we see about here. You can see sharpness is strong by this corner, but by here as we reach towards the corners, it's starting to drop. And as we get down here to the corner, you can see it's not terrible, but you can see it's not really clearly defined. Contrast is a little bit lower. Taking a look in the upper left corner, you can see a similar pattern. I would argue maybe this one looks a tiny bit better, but it's basically the similar end result. If we take that into a real-world application, you can see at 100% magnification in the center and the mid-frame, detail and contrast look fantastic, great. But if we pan over here to the edge, you can see that it's just getting progressively mushier. Starting at about this point right here, you can see that it's starting to drop at f1.8, and so that just kind of following the same pattern we saw on the test chart. Stopping on down to f5.6, we can see that center of the frame looks good, and now as we pan towards the edge, it is looking much closer, and so less of a drop off to the corner or the edge. By f5.6 and then f8, we're not looking any better in the center of the frame, but as we look at other places like the mid frame, particularly at f5.6, looking sharper, up here into the corner, now looking pretty consistently good. At f8, you can see we're just starting to turn the corner when it comes to diffraction, a little softer. That pattern continues on with f11 looking softer still, and then f16 you can see starting to lose contrast and some of the fine details due to diffraction. Now at 24 millimeters, you can see at f1.8, detail is looking good in the center of the frame. You can see contrast kicking up by f2.8. We can see that the mid frame is good at f1.8, but it's getting excellent by f2.8. And if we look up here in the corner, very interestingly, we can see that while that last few percentage points is softer here even at f1.8 it's looking quite good, and by f2.8 it's looking excellent. You can see that that's stretching over this direction, that this emblem, for example, has better contrast and delineation compared to the f1.8. It's just really that last little bit that is softer by comparison, and frankly that's probably not going to be too big of a deal for most people. For example, here at f5.6, we can see that center and mid-frame look great, but as we come down here towards the corner, it's looking good all the way until just this little bit right here. And frankly, it's unlikely that too many people are going to be looking at that zone. And you can see all the edge stuff towards the center of the frame. It all looks fantastic. So I think that at 24 millimeters, people are going to be pretty delighted with the optical performance. When I was doing comparisons at 35 millimeters, I found the end results to just be very, very comparable. It's following a very similar kind of pattern all across the frame, and so you can see it looks great here and just a little bit softer right there into that corner. Here's a real-world example at f2.2, so just stop down a tiny bit. You can see how nice and crisp all the detail and textures are, and then a really nicely soft-looking background. And here's the advantage of having that larger maximum aperture compared to an f2.8 zoom. Now at 40 millimeters, we can see that contrast is a little bit lower at f1.8. It's bouncing back strongly by f2.8. We can see that contrast is similar, but you can also see that the detail is good in a little bit more consistent fashion, and so it's not as soft like in this zone, for example. A little more of a consistent profile, though you can also see it doesn't sharpen up quite as much as maybe it did in the middle of the zoom range. But if we look at a scene from both ends of the equation, so at f5.6, this is at 17 millimeters. You can see in the middle of the frame, detail is looking great. And here, I think that looking at a real-world image, everyone's going to be satisfied with that. No problem there. Jumping into 40 millimeters, you can see once again in the center of the frame, also f5.6, detail and contrast looks awesome, and you can see right off here to the edges of the frame looking really good. This is enough sharpness and contrast, I think, for most everyone in most all situations. So we can see that while we have a high level of magnification, we can also see that up-close performance at f1.8 is not great. It's not particularly sharp and detailed, and there's definitely some fringing issues that are impacting it. And so in this shot, for example, I'm not really blown away by the up-close performance and the amount of detail that's there. You can see little hints of that teal fringing showing up. However, if I stop down a bit here at f2.5, you can see that contrast and detail is looking a lot better. And then this image at f2.8, I think it looks pretty fantastic. That image is really popping in terms of detail and colors that are coming off of it. And so stop down a bit if you're wanting to shoot up close, if you want to improve close-up performance. Now, at its best, I think the bokeh looks really nice and soft. And so here's a great example. Again, if you're up close, allows you to really strongly blur out a background. I think this image looks really nice, not too many hard edges. And so all of that's looking nice and clean. Moving back a bit, I felt like this image retained a nice softness of background, but also a nice, I think, three-dimensional quality of the branches being shot here. Also here, I think here we've got some transition zone stuff handled quite nicely. And again, a nice kind of three-dimensional pop to this that allows that to be a different kind of image that would be hard to shoot with an f2.8 zoom. We've already looked at flare resistance a bit, and here you can see in the shots that I like to do with the morning light coming across the top of the grass, you can see that it's holding up nicely there, and so the image doesn't have any kind of weird ghosting artifacts or anything spoiling it. And so overall, other than the fringing and some of the barrel distortion, it's really doing quite good.
So as you can see, Sigma has done it once again. They've managed to give us the biggest zoom range we've ever seen with an f1.8 maximum aperture. And they've managed to pull it off to where this lens is really quite strong optically in just about all areas. And so that's pretty impressive. As always, thanks for watching. Have a great day and let the light in.